Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, after long last, AMD B550 motherboards are finally going on sale. There's been plenty of talk about the B550 chipset and all the supporting boards for weeks now, so it's great that we can finally share our results with you. We also have official information regarding the upcoming Ryzen 3000XT series, so let's quickly talk about that. As expected, there will be a Ryzen 9 3900XT, Ryzen 7 3800XT, and Ryzen 5 3600XT, all offering up to a 4% increase in single-thread performance. Here's a quick look at the specs. The 3900XT comes in at $500, the 3800XT at $400, and the 3600XT at $250 US, so the exact same launch prices as the original X versions. It's hard to say if these new processors will be worth the price premium, but for most of you it won't matter too much as the current 3rd gen Ryzen processors will continue to exist and sell at the current asking prices. I have to say that personally I'm not too excited by this. It's very late in the product cycle, so it makes very little sense to invest in 3rd gen Ryzen unless you're getting parts at really competitive prices, like what you do with the Ryzen 5 3600 at $165 US for example. And this is because we know 4th gen Ryzen isn't that far away. Lisa Su has said it's coming this year, so we're expecting it within the next 6 months. And that means spending $500 US on the 3900XT might not be the wisest of investments right now. Still, for those interested, these parts, as Tim predicted, will go on sale on July 7th. Okay, so getting back to the motherboards. As usual, I'm going to focus on VRM thermal performance, and the main goal of our B550 testing will be to find the cheapest motherboards that can support the Ryzen 9 3900X and 3950X, as those processors will make for a nice second-hand upgrade option down the track. Unfortunately for now, I don't have any of the more entry-level B550 motherboards. I'll probably have to go and purchase those myself once they go on sale. In the meantime, I have the MSI B550M Mortar, the MSI B550 Tomahawk, Gigabyte B550 Aorus Pro, and the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Master. So I'll test those boards out and see how they handle. But before I do, I'm going to talk quite a bit about B550 motherboard pricing and why they are more expensive than what a lot of people were expecting. And for this discussion, I'll be focusing on the MSI range, and I'll be doing so for a few reasons. But please note, this video has in no way been sponsored by MSI. They also happen to supply 2 boards for this video, along with a detailed breakdown of their entire B550 range, including stuff like VRM configurations and pricing. And that's not something I was able to get from any of their competitors. So just by being helpful, they're getting all the attention here. The B450 Tomahawk hit shelves at around $110 US, and through the course of its life typically sold for somewhere between $110 and $120 US. The most expensive B450 board from MSI was the Pro Carbon, and it sold for around $130 to $140 US, and this for many was a bit too much to pay for a B450 motherboard, and that made the Tomahawk the go-to option for many. This is why pricing info for the new B550 boards wasn't very well received. The B550 Gaming Carbon Wi-Fi is coming in at an eye-watering $220 US, while the new B550 Tomahawk will set you back $180 US. Even the B550M Mortar, which is one of the boards I have on hand, that costs $160, the Gaming Plus $150, the A Pro $140, and the Bazooka $130. On the surface, those prices are pretty shocking, but when you start to dig into what these boards offer, you do start to realize that the price increases aren't nearly as extreme as they first appear. Now, I'm not trying to defend any price hikes here. We're always pushing for better pricing, but we like to do so while being realistic in our demands. Now, the main reason why the B550 range costs more than the B450 range is very simple. It's just way better. The B550 Tomahawk, for example, isn't just the B450 Tomahawk with the newer chipset, it is far more than that. And this is where motherboard naming can get a bit tricky, as the Tomahawk branding doesn't target a certain price point. The Z490 Tomahawk, for example, that costs $180 US, the X299 Tomahawk, that's around $250, and the X570 Tomahawk, that's meant to cost $200 US. So, what are some of the reasons why the B550 version of the Tomahawk costs around $60 more than the B450 version? Firstly, despite being one of the best B450 motherboards in terms of VRM quality, the Tomahawk was still very basic, featuring a 4-phase V-core with doubled up on semiconductor discrete MOSFETs, and in fact, that very same VRM can be found on the $130 B550M Bazooka. The B550 Tomahawk, on the other hand, that has been upgraded well beyond the point of any B450 motherboard with a massive 10-phase V-core VRM featuring 60 amp intersil power stages, the very same power stages you'll find on the excellent X570 Tomahawk. and that board packs 2 more power stages for a 12-phase V-Core VRM. So, in theory, the B550 Tomahawk has 83% of the X570 Tomahawk's current capacity. Then in terms of board features, when compared to the B450 Tomahawk, the newer version offers an additional M.2 slot with support for PCIe 4.0 SSDs, and of course the primary PCIe x16 slot now also supports PCIe 4.0. In addition to the PCIe 4.0 support, you're also getting USB 3.2 Gen 2, 2.5 gigabit LAN, front USB Type-C, M.2 shields, better PCB, pre-installed I/O shield, much larger VRM cooling to go with the bigger VRM, a better board layout, and just a higher quality motherboard in general. So there's really no comparing the two. They're in completely different tiers, and of course the pricing reflects that. What all this means is the closest ATX model to the B450 Tomahawk would be the B550A Pro. It costs $140 US, so almost 20% more, but again, you're getting more motherboard. The VRM uses many of the same components, there's just more of them, and doublers are now included, creating a 10-phase V-Core VRM with 25% more current capacity. There's also more features on board. Again, USB 3.2 Gen 2 and PCIe 4.0 are included, there's 2 more USB ports on the I/O panel, and you get front USB Type-C support. The VRM heatsinks are also larger, and you get a better quality PCB with 2-ounce thickened copper. So an almost 20% premium doesn't sound too unreasonable given those upgrades. Then we have the MSI B550M Bazooka that comes in at $130 US, so around $10 more than the B450 Tomahawk, and it features the exact same VRM. However, it still offers an additional M.2 slot, which supports PCIe 4.0x4 bandwidth, front USB Type-C, and a thickened copper PCB. Though it does drop USB 3.2 Gen 2 support when compared to other B550 motherboards, not when compared to the B450 Tomahawk, and it also drops 2 of the 6 gigabits per second SATA ports. It's also worth noting that the B450 Tomahawk and its Max variant aren't going away overnight, so you'll still be able to purchase the B450 boards for some time after the B550 release. MSI is likely doing this to help fill the void until B550 pricing filters down, which happens all the time with motherboard platforms. Though be aware that I'm not promising any price drops, I'm merely pointing out they often occur. For example, there are a number of X570 boards which have fallen in price since release, though admittedly pricing right now is a bit messed up due to that global pandemic thing. You might have heard about it. There's also the fallout with the country where just about everything is made. Won't get into that, but yeah, some stuff has happened in 2020 to put it mildly. But to give you an example, the Asus entry-level Tough Gaming X570 Plus, which launched at $190, dropped just 4 months later to $165 and has remained there since. And that's despite us and others giving it a rave review. In fact, there are now plenty of X570 models around that $160 price point. I would expect something similar to happen with B550. High launch prices for a few months, and then by the holiday season, things will start to drop down. So there are a few things to consider here, but what I really think we're witnessing is an increased demand for Ryzen products, and board makers want to get in on the action. Ryzen's now made it through that period of uncertainty. First gen Ryzen was a huge turning point for AMD, and consumer confidence grew rapidly. As a result, B450 sales were significantly higher than that of B350, which I'm told by all accounts still did very well. Therefore, having seen the strong demand for B450 motherboards priced over $100 US, board makers are confident that B550 can command higher price points, allowing them to make better, more expensive motherboards. This isn't a situation where board makers or AMD are attempting to price gouge, something I've seen many people claiming. As I pointed out with the Tomahawk example, there are good and justifiable reasons for the price increases. Okay, so enough about pricing for now. I think we've covered that one well enough. Let's get on with testing the VRM thermal performance of the models we currently have. For this testing, I'll be using the same configuration used to test the X570 motherboards, as I want to be able to compare the thermal data with these newer B550 boards. Though please note, the X570 boards were tested quite some time ago using earlier AGESA versions, so there might be some discrepancies there. This is a fairly extreme VRM test setup, as the idea initially was to stress test the higher end X570 boards to ensure they could handle the Ryzen 9 processors under all conditions. And the plan even at the time was to retest with the Ryzen 9 3950X, given that the 3900X was the most high-end AM4 CPU available at the time of testing. But in the end, the 3950X really didn't use that much more power than the 3900X, so we didn't bother. So rather than install the boards in an ATX case like we often do, we're using an open air test bench with no direct airflow. However, through further testing, I've found that the results in a poorly ventilated case are actually worse. So I guess this isn't an absolute worst case scenario. No pun intended. Now, placing load on the CPU is the Blender Gooseberry workload, and the temperatures reported are the peaks for the hour-long duration. And for recording the temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'm reporting the peak rear PCB temperature. I'm also not reporting delta T over ambient. Instead, I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, as this is by far the most accurate way to conduct this testing. And monitoring the ambient temperature is a thermocouple positioned next to the test system. Okay, so here are our baseline results. It's essentially out-of-the-box performance with the Ryzen 3000X and PBO enabled. The motherboards are left to determine the appropriate voltages on their own, so it's a very basic overclock that anyone can do themselves with the help of AMD's Windows-based Ryzen Master software. The very best result that we've recorded to date on any AM4 motherboard was with the Aorus Extreme at 55 degrees, while the worst result technically comes from the MSI MPG X570 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi, which had to throttle the CPU during this test for its own survival. The MSI X570A Pro actually ran hotter, but it avoided throttling in this test, so it is technically a pass. What's incredible to note here is just how cool these B550 boards run. Even the mortar was comparable to the X570 Aorus Pro Wi-Fi under these test conditions, and the B550 board costs almost $100 less. And even Gigabyte's own B550 Aorus Pro ran a few degrees cooler than the X570 version with the same branding, and it's around 30% cheaper. The MSI B550 Tomahawk was also excellent, peaking at just 60 degrees, making it 2 degrees hotter than the X570 Tomahawk, and just 5 degrees hotter than the $700 Aorus Extreme. Then we have the B550 Aorus Master matching the X570 Aorus Extreme with a peak temperature of 55 degrees. And you might be wondering, how does a $280 B550 board manage to match a $700 X570 board from the same company? Well, the answer is it uses the exact same VRM with the same real finned heatsinks. Oh, and it's a little over 20% cheaper than the X570 Aorus Master. Now, here are the overclocked results with the Ryzen 3900X running all cores at 4.3 GHz using 1.4 volts. Again, we're using a high voltage to really stress the boards and help us weed out the runts like the X570A Pro and Gaming Edge Wi-Fi, MSI's regrettable mistakes. Despite those extreme test conditions, the B550M mortar passed with relative ease, peaking at just 80 degrees, basically putting slightly more expensive X570 ASRock and Gigabyte models to shame like the Steel Legend, Pro 4 and Gaming X. With a small amount of airflow, there is no AM4 CPU this board won't handle with ease. That being the case, the Gigabyte B550 Aorus Pro and Master were extremely impressive, as was MSI's B550 Tomahawk. And to help better illustrate the point that these B550 boards aren't overpriced, I've added the US launch prices for all the boards. Here we see that the B550 Tomahawk and Aorus Pro look pretty good at $180, comfortably beating similarly priced X570 boards such as the award-winning ASUS TUF Gaming. Also, as I just noted, the $160 MSI B550M mortar shames countless X570 boards priced up to and even beyond $200 US. The B550 Aorus Master is obviously very expensive, but in terms of features, it does something no other B550 board does by offering 3 PCIe 4.0x4 M.2 slots, plus it borrows its VRM from a $700 flagship X570 board. Well, there you have it. These new B550 motherboards are certainly a significant upgrade from the now 2-year-old B450 boards. MSI and Gigabyte have done an excellent job with the models that we checked out in this video, and I'm very keen to buy the base models and see how they handle the 3900X. But it looks like for a little over $100, you'll now be able to get a board supporting PCIe 4.0 along with higher-end AM4 CPUs. And this does make the B550 delay all the more frustrating, as it would have been really nice to have these boards available for those who purchase something like the Ryzen 5 3600, of course with a new motherboard. Not only do these new B550 boards support PCIe 4.0 graphics cards and storage, but they also offer a more seamless transition for those wanting to upgrade to Zen 3 processors sometime in the future. If you bought a Ryzen 5 3600 a year ago, there is a very real possibility that you might want to buy a Zen 3 part with more cores. But I guess that's a story for later in the year. In the meantime, the new AMD B550 chipset can be viewed as another nail in the Intel 10th Gen Core Series coffin. The B550 Tomahawk, for example, is slightly cheaper than the Z490 Tomahawk, but despite that you get PCIe 4.0, and that's a feature that appears to be missing entirely from the Z490 version, even with future Intel CPUs. Boards like the MSI B550A Pro will be the real killers though. At $140 US, that looks like a very solid board, and I can't wait to check it out along with the other entry-level boards from Gigabyte, ASUS, and ASRock. As a side note, there will be A520 boards, but I think we'll largely ignore those on the channel, just as we did with the A320 boards. In the case of the A320 chipset and the supporting motherboards, you often stood to save just $10. And for that saving, you gave up stuff like CPU and memory overclocking, CPU support was almost always worse, and the boards were just overall much lower quality. In my opinion, that just never made sense, and I think it's likely going to be the same story with the A520. So if that is once again the case and you are still for some reason interested in them, you'll have to look to other channels who are pushing that stuff. I'm somewhat interested to see how the Ryzen 3000XT processors perform, and I'll be able to show you that data in 3 weeks' time. But I'm not expecting anything amazing, and I say that because I've seen a shocking amount of people claiming they'll beat Intel in games, and that's simply not going to be the case. At least not in most conditions. AMD themselves are only claiming a 4% performance uplift, that's it, and while that will reduce the already imperceptible margin for most gamers, don't expect these XT processors to be 10th gen killers in games. Not going to happen. And in terms of value, they're very likely going to be worse than the parts we already have. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. If you liked the video, you know what to do. You can subscribe for more content just like this. And if you would like to get more involved with the Hardware Unboxed channel, watch our live streams, which will be coming up shortly. I think we'll probably be doing that next week. We've also got the Patreon Q&As, Patreon exclusive Discord chat, where you can chat with Tim and I and the rest of the awesome Hardware Unboxed community. If you're interested, link is in the video description. Check that out. Otherwise, just a big thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.